Hello class, welcome to lecture 7, and in this lecture we're going to explore some more of the physical consequences of friction on our flow patterns in the atmosphere, and also take a look at something called the gradient wind balance and some of the physical consequences of that as well. But first thing we're going to do is we're going to sort of pick off where we left off last lecture and take a look at some more of the physical consequences that we can have when we introduce friction into our conceptual model of the atmosphere. So let's first consider a system that's kind of similar to what we looked at in the previous lecture, but let's also I'll just go ahead and put the wind vector up on the screen here. So this is what we determined what the wind vector looks like when friction is really significant. The wind vector wants to go towards the area of lower pressure and away from the area of higher pressure, as opposed to just going on this diagram straight from left to right. It actually wants to go towards the center of the low. And the reason why the wind does this is because of the fact that we have friction at this level in the atmosphere. However, if we take a look at these pressure contours and think about the geostrophic balance, so since these pressure contours are perfectly straight, we can sort of think about geostrophic balance, except for the fact that we have friction here. So at the lowest level, we can't say it's geostrophic, but as we go higher up in the atmosphere, friction becomes weaker with height. So therefore, it would stand to reason that geostrophic balance becomes more applicable to our wind field as we go up in altitude. So that means at some point, once we get above an area where friction is really strong, once we get to a point where friction is really weak, then we'll have a wind that more resembles geostrophic balance, like the dark blue arrow here. So we'd have something that starts off like this, a relatively weak wind that's blowing towards areas of lower pressure, and then at some point, once we get to a high enough elevation, when friction becomes negligible, the wind will more resemble a geostrophic wind. Now, in order to maintain some sort of continuity here, that means the wind has to actually turn in this direction with height. And that's actually what a fairly common wind flow pattern to see in the lowest 1 to 2 kilometers of the atmosphere, where friction goes from really strong to weaker and weaker as you get above the boundary layer. And this turning in the clockwise direction with height, so again, the bright blue arrow is the lowest elevation, the dark blue arrow is the highest elevation. As these winds turn with height, as they turn in the clockwise direction, that's known as veering, when the wind turns clockwise with height. And the inverse of that is if the winds turn counterclockwise with height, and those are known as backing winds. And we'll talk more about those when we get into the thermal wind balance. But for now, the fact that the friction decreases with height explains why the wind tends to turn clockwise with height as we go from the surface up to higher levels in the atmosphere. Now, this is not always the case. This is just a common tendency. Sometimes you can get winds that turn the other direction in the lowest 1 to 2 kilometers, but again, we'll talk more about that when we get into the thermal wind balance. But just a general everyday tendency, usually the winds turn clockwise with height, and the reason why is because the friction is getting weaker with height. The wind becomes more geostrophic as a result. So that's another physical consequence that we can have. Another one that we're going to take a look at in this segment has to do with what happens around the vicinity of a low pressure system. So consider 4 points here given by the black dots. So at each one of these points, the pressure gradient force points inward toward the area of lower pressure. And that's represented by the blue areas here. All the pressure gradient force vectors point towards the area of lower pressure. And we're basically going to do the same exercise that we did at the end of lecture 6, but we're going to do it at some key points around the vicinity of a low pressure system. So in order for there to be some sort of balance, then the Coriolis force has to oppose the pressure gradient force. And the only way that the Coriolis force can point outward is if our wind is turning counterclockwise around the low. We'll just for the sake of simplicity consider this as a case in the northern hemisphere. So the only way the Coriolis vectors can point this way is if the wind is turning counterclockwise around our low pressure system here. Now, this is strictly not a geostrophic balance because technically the winds are traveling in a circle, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll just consider each individual point we'll just say at each individual point we can think of that specific point as being in geostrophic balance, but the entire wind pattern is not in geostrophic balance. If that doesn't make sense, then it's not really important. The main thing that you want to take away from here is what ultimately results when we introduce friction into our flow pattern. But if we were thinking about each individual point as being in geostrophic balance, then we get a wind vector that looks like this. And that's typically what you see in the northern hemisphere. The wind turns counterclockwise around areas of lower pressure. Now we'll throw friction into the equation again. And remember from the previous lecture, when we put in friction, that in turn weakens the wind. And since the wind has to weaken, that also means that the Coriolis force weakens, because remember, Coriolis force depends on the speed of the wind or the speed of the object in question. And again, remember that throws off our force balance. Now we no longer have a Coriolis force and a pressure gradient force that perfectly balance each other out. Now the pressure gradient force is dominating since the Coriolis force is weaker. So that tends to guide the wind away from a perfectly circular path in this case. It tends to guide it towards the center of lower pressure. Again, we saw the logic behind that in the previous lecture, so hopefully most of this is review. But I want to go ahead and sort of highlight what exactly happens here. So the faded green arrows, that shows what would happen if friction weren't factored in. And if we didn't have friction, we'd have a perfectly circular flow pattern going around the center of the low. The air particles that flow around the center of the low maintain the same distance as they go around the low. They trace out a perfect circle. But since the wind deviates from that circular trajectory, the wind actually goes toward the center of the low. That ultimately results in a wind pattern that looks something like this. The wind converges to the center of the low, and that ultimately results in rising motion. And at the end of the lecture, we'll see a diagram to help visualize why exactly that results in rising motion. But since we have the fact that we have friction in the lowest 1 to 2 kilometers of the atmosphere, that causes the wind to deviate towards areas of lower pressure. And if you think about a large-scale low-pressure system like the one we have here, if all the winds are going towards the center of the low, that means the winds are converging on the low and they're all rising upward, because the wind can't go into the ground, it has to go upward. And again, we'll illustrate that in greater detail towards the end of this lecture. Now let's take a look at another case, but in this case, we'll take a look at a high, what happens around the vicinity of the high. So in this case, the pressure gradient force points in the opposite direction. Instead of pointing towards the center of the low, or the center of the screen in the previous case, now the pressure gradient force points outward, which means in order to balance that, in order for the Coriolis force to balance that, the Coriolis force must point inward towards the center of the high. And the only way that the Coriolis force can be pointing inward is if the wind is rotating clockwise around the area of higher pressure. That means the wind has to be going in the direction like this, because remember, the northern hemisphere, Coriolis force is directed to the right of motion. So the only way the Coriolis force can point this way is that the wind is turning clockwise as it's going around the high pressure system. And just like with the low, we'll throw friction into the equation again. That's going to weaken our wind and also weaken our Coriolis force. So again, the wind's going to tend in the direction of the pressure gradient force, which means the wind is going to try and go towards areas of lower pressure. So that'll give us a flow pattern that looks like this. Again, the wind vector is represented by the green arrows. And again, if we take a look at how this deviates from a normal flow pattern, so again, just like with the low, the faded green arrows here show what would be a perfect circular trajectory if there was no friction involved. But since friction is involved, the wind vectors again deviate towards areas of lower pressure. But if you look at this from the perspective of a high pressure, from what happens around the periphery of a high pressure system, that means the winds all go away from the center of the high pressure system. Since you have divergence at the surface, that means you must have sinking motion. And again, we'll see an illustration of this later on, but for now I just want to give you guys sort of a preview of the diagram that will come at the end of the lecture. So force of friction causes the wind to converge at the area of lower pressure, and it also causes the wind to diverge away from areas of higher pressure. And again, those are areas of low pressure are referred to as cyclones, and high pressure, of course, referred to as anticyclones. So that's going to do it for this first segment, and in the next segment, we will be covering the gradient wind balance and take a look at what happens when, instead of factoring friction, we'll factor in centrifugal force and see what consequences that has on our flow pattern. So with that, I will see you all in the next segment.